The sandwich was supposed to be a nostalgic indulgence, a quick bite in the place that bore his wife's name and his life's purpose. But when the man behind the counter laughed and muttered, "He still thinks this place matters," something inside Harold Gaines broke. He froze mid-bite, his heart pounding like a war drum as a second voice whispered, "If he ever finds out, we're done." In that instant, the diner wasn't a tribute anymore. It was a crime scene waiting to unfold. And as Harold sat quietly in the booth he once built with his bare hands, one haunting question echoed louder than the sizzling grill. What were they hiding, and how long had they been getting away with it? The rain had stopped just an hour before sunrise, leaving the streets of Fairbridge slick and shimmering under the dim orange glow of street lamps. Harold Gaines sat behind the wheel of a rented sedan parked across from the diner that bore his legacy, heart pounding harder than he'd expected. The windows were fogged, the engine silent, and his reflection in the rearview mirror barely recognizable. The cap on his head cast a shadow over eyes once known in Fortune 500 boardrooms, and the thrift store hoodie draped over his frame concealed the crisp suit he'd worn just yesterday at a downtown charity gala. For most of his life, Harold had been the face of a franchise empire that stretched from coast to coast, a self-made success story. But this place, this one small-town diner, was the only location he ever truly cared about. Built in memory of his late wife Marianne, Harry's Place was supposed to be a refuge of warmth and good food, a living monument to her belief that kindness could be a business model. Now, he wasn't so sure. The decision to visit Undercover hadn't come lightly. Over the past few months, vague red flags had been trickling in. A customer complaint filed with no follow-up. An anonymous email from an employee mentioning a toxic atmosphere, a sudden spike in food waste margins that didn't add up, and strangest of all, an abrupt resignation from the general manager, a man Harold had personally mentored. Something about it all felt off. But Harold was a man who trusted his gut, and his gut told him the time for passive oversight was over. He stepped out of the car, inhaled the earthy scent of wet asphalt, and crossed the street like a man walking into a past life. The diner hadn't changed much, at least not on the surface. The neon open 24/7 sign buzzed in that familiar staccato rhythm, casting flickering blue shadows across the sidewalk. Inside, the booths were the same faux leather he'd chosen decades ago. The same framed photos hung on the walls, Harold and Marian cutting the ribbon on opening day, a waitress hugging a local football team, a baby's first bite of mashed potatoes. These weren't just memories. They were his memories. But now they looked like someone else's story. The sparkle was gone. The energy muted. As he stepped through the door and the little bell chimed above him, not a single head turned. No warm greeting. No enthusiastic, "Welcome to Harry's." Just a distracted cashier tapping on her phone behind the counter. Harold chose a corner booth by instinct, the same one he and Marianne had always sat in during their unannounced visits. A young waitress approached, offering a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. He ordered a coffee and a bacon-egg sandwich, grateful she didn't ask questions. As she walked away, Harold surveyed the room. Only a few other customers sat scattered throughout the diner. A trucker reading a folded newspaper, an older couple sharing pancakes in silence, a teenage boy scrolling his phone while his food cooled in front of him. The mood was sterile, efficient, but not welcoming. Something was missing. He looked toward the counter and noticed two employees chatting casually near the register. A young woman with short, dark hair and a red-haired guy who kept glancing toward the kitchen door. Their voices were low, but Harold's ears were trained for subtext. He leaned slightly forward, pretending to check his phone while tuning in. The girl, Kayla, if he remembered correctly from a past staff roster, murmured, "I swear, if he ever comes back, we're toast." The redhead chuckled, his tone almost mocking. "Come on, he's ancient. Probably forgotten he owns this dump." Kayla laughed harder than necessary, tossing a glance toward the office door. "As long as we keep covering the shifts and the money looks clean on paper, who cares?" Harold froze, coffee mug in hand, steam rising into the space between him and a truth he hadn't prepared for. Was he hearing this right? He strained to catch more. Besides, the guy added, "No one's gonna look too close at the comps." We've been running this play for months. Kayla replied with a smirk. I still can't believe we pulled it off. He still thinks this place is a shrine or something. Like it actually matters. Then came the kicker. A laugh followed by, if only his precious Marion knew what we did with the back office last Friday. Something in Harold's stomach turned. The mention of her name, his wife's name, used like a punchline. His hand tightened around the cup, knuckles white. The warmth of the diner seemed to drain away, replaced by a cold, prickling sweat. His mouth felt dry. Did they vandalize the office? Steal from the safe? Mock her memory? He didn't know what they meant. But he knew the tone. It was contempt. Not just for him, but for everything he thought this place stood for. The sandwich arrived, but he didn't touch it. The waitress noticed and hesitated, as if sensing something wasn't right, then walked away without a word. Harold sat there for another 20 minutes, listening to the rhythm of a business he no longer recognized. Every misplaced order, every half-hearted greeting, every crude joke from behind the counter became another pinprick in his chest. He had spent years cultivating a brand built on dignity, pride, and purpose. But here, in the diner that started it all, those values were being quietly buried beneath apathy and arrogance. The worst part was how effortlessly it had happened. No grand betrayal, no dramatic sabotage, just slow erosion minute by minute, laugh by cruel laugh. He left cash on the table, slid out of the booth, and walked out without finishing his meal. Outside, the air was sharper, the clouds darker. He didn't look back. Not yet. There was too much to process. He needed to be alone, to think, to plan. Because if what he heard was true, this wasn't just about two disgruntled employees. It was about something deeper, something poisonous. And Harold Gaines had no intention of letting his wife's legacy rot from the inside out. This was no longer just a secret visit. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The sky outside had shifted from cloudy gray to a dull, overcast white by the time Harold found himself standing behind the tinted window of a nearby hardware store, peering back across the street at his diner. His heart hadn't stopped pounding since he'd left that booth, and the words he'd overheard replayed in his mind like a skipping record. He still thinks this place is a shrine or something. That one stung the most. Marianne had handpicked the wallpaper. She chose the plates because they reminded her of her grandmother's kitchen. Every decision, down to the font on the menus, had her touch embedded in it. But now that legacy had been reduced to a joke, a punchline for bored, smug employees. And yet, despite the betrayal, Harold wasn't ready to act. Not without more. He had always operated on one principle in business and in life. Never confront a problem without understanding it fully. And so, he turned back toward the diner, slipped into a small alley that ran along the side of the building, and listened. The diner's side entrance was for employees only, often propped open during deliveries or busy shifts. Today, it was cracked just enough to hear voices from the kitchen. Harold stayed hidden behind a rusted dumpster, ducking down whenever footsteps approached. He could hear the muffled sounds of conversation, metal trays clanging, the sizzle of oil on the grill. But then, clear as a bell, came Kayla's voice again, lower this time, but sharper. I don't care what the system says. You punch in late, you're short a tip out, period. I'm not covering for your laziness anymore. Another voice, male, but not the redhead from earlier, snapped back. You serious? After what you did with the register last week? Silence, then a nervous laugh. Yeah, well, at least I didn't mess up the safe code. That one's on you. A third voice chimed in. Y'all better shut up about that. You never know who's listening. Harold froze. The safe. The register. A mistake with the code. These weren't harmless workplace grievances. This was operational misconduct. Maybe worse. He pulled out his phone, considered recording, but thought better of it. Instead, he committed everything to memory. The tone. The names. The words. He recognized the third voice now. Desmond, a cashier who'd only been with the company for 6 months. Harold had approved his hiring personally after reading a glowing recommendation letter. That thought twisted in his gut now. How many of these people had he trusted blindly? He moved closer, footsteps muffled by the wet concrete. Inside, the conversation had shifted to something even darker. Kayla again. We should have wiped the cameras the night we took the bottle from the back. Now it's probably still on the drive. Desmond, don't worry. Liam said the DVR's been glitching for months. No one's gonna check. Besides, nobody cares about a bottle of whiskey. The redhead, Liam apparently, added with a snort. That bottle was worth $300, by the way. Some collector's crap. Bet the old man would cry if he knew it was gone. Another round of laughter, followed by the unmistakable sound of a high five. Harold gritted his teeth. It wasn't about the money. It was about intent, about trust, about how quickly a business could rot when no one believed the owner was watching. And they were right about one thing: Harold hadn't been watching. Not closely. Not since the franchise exploded and he started focusing on expansion. He'd believed that setting a tone and hiring the right people would be enough. But this was proof that even the strongest culture could decay in silence. These weren't just isolated jokes or slips of misconduct. This was a full-blown breach of values. His values, Marianne's values, the very foundation this diner had been built on. And it was worse than theft, it was corrosion. As Harold backed away from the alley, rain beginning to fall again in light misting drops, he knew what had to happen next. He wouldn't return to the hotel just yet. Instead, he circled around to the front of the diner and re-entered, moving past the same counter he'd sat at just an hour before. None of the cashiers even glanced up. They didn't recognize him. They didn't care. He ordered another coffee, sat in a different booth, and waited. He watched the staff interact, watched Kayla handle a refund without logging it into the system, watched Desmond pocket a $5 bill left behind by a customer without even pretending to tip it out. He watched Liam laugh with a line cook as they swapped onion rings for mozzarella sticks on a to-go order, pocketing the difference in cash. It wasn't a rogue act, it was routine. And then, just as Harold was about to leave, something caught his ear again. Desmond leaned over to Kayla and muttered, "You really think he's dead?" Kayla blinked, looked around, then shrugged. Old man hasn't shown his face in 2 years. Could be. Wouldn't change anything. Liam added, "Doesn't matter. As long as the district manager stays off our backs, we're golden." That's when Harold realized it wasn't just moral decay. It was a mutiny of memory. They had buried him in their minds. Assumed he was gone, irrelevant. A ghost whose name still hung on the sign but meant nothing inside the walls. His heart ached. Not from anger, but from grief. These people weren't just stealing from his business. They were desecrating his legacy, mocking his life's work, and worse, erasing the woman whose vision gave it meaning. He stood slowly, left another cash payment on the table, and walked out without looking back. This time, his direction was clear. He was going to gather records, comb through security footage, and get a full picture of how deep this rot went. Because now it wasn't just about fixing a broken system. It was about confronting the people who had turned his wife's sanctuary into their personal playground. The next time he stepped into Harry's place, it wouldn't be as a quiet stranger. It would be as the storm they never saw coming. The rain had turned heavier by the time Harold made it back to his hotel. The kind of persistent drizzle that soaked into your bones and matched the weight of whatever thoughts clung to your mind. He peeled off his damp hoodie, tossed it over the back of a chair, and stood in front of the window overlooking the town's modest skyline. Fairbridge wasn't large, but from his 10th floor room, it seemed even smaller than he remembered. Just a scatter of rooftops, church steeples, and flickering gas station signs. Somewhere within that patchwork sat the diner, glowing falsely beneath its neon smile. But Harold wasn't staring at the view. He was staring into the reflection of a man who once believed good intentions were enough. He poured himself a glass of water, hands trembling slightly, and opened his laptop with a sense of urgency usually reserved for boardroom crises. The time for sentiment had passed. He needed facts. The first thing he pulled up were the last 18 months of financial statements from Harry's place. Nothing outwardly screamed corruption. Sales were steady. Payroll hovered within expected margins. Inventory fluctuated, but not in any alarming way, until he dug deeper. The comp reports, the logs of meals given away, refunded or voided, showed a disturbing pattern. Entire days where the numbers tripled with no recorded incidents to explain the spike. Refunds logged minutes apart under different servers' names. On 3 separate occasions, Kayla's name appeared next to voided transactions that totaled over $200 in a single shift, yet the camera timestamps for those hours showed minimal foot traffic. Harold cross-referenced these discrepancies with tip-out reports and found more irregularities. Desmond and Liam, despite working similar hours to other staff, consistently declared less in tips, and yet pulled more from the shift's drawer. It was sloppy, amateur-level embezzlement, but effective enough to remain hidden from the surface view. Next, he accessed the personnel files. The staff list had turned over more rapidly than he'd expected. Many of the names he remembered were gone. A few he didn't recognize at all. The general manager, who had suddenly resigned 6 weeks ago, had written a vague exit note about hostile work dynamics and broken chain of trust. At the time, Harold had assumed it was burnout. But now it read like a cry for help. Even more alarming was a string of customer reviews on third-party platforms that painted a different picture than the sanitized feedback his corporate reports had highlighted. Complaints of rude staff, cold food, missed orders, and even one chilling post from a woman who claimed a cashier threatened to spit in her coffee after she asked for a receipt. These reviews weren't just red flags, they were warnings, and he had missed them all. But the most disturbing discovery came when Harold stumbled across Marianne's archived email folder, one he had preserved on a personal drive after her passing. Out of habit more than intention, he searched for Kayla's name, and froze when a thread popped up from years ago. Marianne had corresponded with a woman named Ellen Perkins, Kayla's mother. The emails were strained, formal, but unmistakably tense. Ellen was asking for help. A job, a loan, maybe even a reference. Marianne had written back politely but firmly, turning her down. "I hope Kayla is doing better now," Marianne wrote. "But I can't support behavior I know to be manipulative." Harold read the sentence twice, heart pounding. There had been tension between his wife and Kayla's family long before Kayla was ever hired. And he had no idea. Another email followed weeks later, this one more aggressive. Ellen accused Marianne of abandoning family and ruining a young girl's future. Marianne never replied. But now Harold understood. Kayla hadn't just ended up at Harry's place by coincidence. She had come in through a back door of resentment, perhaps even revenge, cloaked under the guise of opportunity. He stared at the screen, the cursor blinking beside a message from Mary, and that read like a silent echo. "Some people can't be helped, Harold. Not everyone wants to heal." It hit him like a punch to the gut. He had built this diner on the idea that people could grow, that second chances mattered. But had he been naive? Had he invited a fox into the henhouse by ignoring his wife's warnings? He scrolled back through the files, through the camera logs, and through bank withdrawals. On one clip from 2 months ago, Kayla was seen alone in the office with Liam after closing. The safe door was ajar. The lights were off. And though there was no sound, the timestamp matched a night when nearly $500 in deposits went missing and was chalked up to a vendor error. His pulse thudded louder in his ears. He knew what he was looking at now. This wasn't carelessness. This wasn't staff mismanagement. It was sabotage. Slow, deliberate, and born of resentment. Kayla wasn't just a thief. She was someone who had been waiting for her moment to poison the roots of what he and Marianne had planted. And she had enlisted others, willingly or not, in her cause. Liam, with his careless charm and clear disdain for authority, was the perfect enabler. Desmond, still new and probably eager to belong, was complicit through passivity if nothing else. The picture was coming into focus, and what Harold saw chilled him to his core. He closed the laptop gently, like sealing away a casket. He stared at the ceiling, recalling Marianne's voice, her laugh, the way she used to squeeze his hand when they'd sit at the corner booth during slow afternoons. Her spirit had animated the diner. Her love had poured into every detail. And now her memory was being tainted by people who saw it as nothing more than a paycheck. But Harold wasn't broken. He was focused. He now understood what he was fighting for, Not just the business, not just the brand, but the soul of a place that was supposed to stand for something. And if it meant tearing apart every inch of it to rebuild from the ashes, he would do so gladly. But not yet. First, he had to look his betrayers in the eye. And for that, he needed to return, not as a stranger, not as a ghost, but as a man who knew the truth and was prepared to use it. The morning Harold returned to Harry's place. The sun was just rising over Fairbridge, casting long gold beams over the sidewalks and rooftops as if trying to paint the town in a hopeful light. But the warmth in the sky felt at odds with the storm he was carrying inside him. This time, he didn't wear the hoodie. He didn't dress like the forgotten traveler. He wore a dark wool overcoat, a charcoal turtleneck, and gloves that concealed the shaking in his fingers. His face remained unfamiliar to the employees, the result of time, grief, and years spent out of the public eye. But his presence was heavier now, his steps more deliberate. He wasn't there to observe anymore. He was there to stir the waters and see what floated to the surface. He walked in during the early shift turnover, when staff was transitioning from night duties to the breakfast rush, a time ripe for tension and miscommunication. The moment he entered, he noticed Desmond and Kayla in a hushed argument near the back storage area. They froze briefly when the door chimed, their eyes flickering toward him, then resumed their conversation in even lower tones. Harold took a seat at the counter this time, a few stools down from where Liam was sorting receipts and texting on his phone. The cook behind the line, a broad-shouldered man named Raymond, who had worked there since Marianne's funeral, glanced at Harold, squinted, then went back to flipping eggs. There was a flicker of recognition, but no greeting. That suited Harold fine. He wanted to test how much the old staff still cared, how much the culture had decayed in the trenches. A new waitress, barely 20 and wearing a name tag that said Tina, approached him with a forced smile. He asked her about the day's specials, and she answered robotically, eyes darting to the kitchen as if afraid to be away too long. He asked if Raymond was still the head cook, and her face shifted. Yeah, I guess. Depends on the day. Her answer wasn't careless, it was coded. Something was off with the hierarchy even among the loyal ones. Harold thanked her and watched the room begin to move with the arrival of the breakfast crowd. The energy was jittery. Kayla barked orders at another cashier with no hint of professionalism, her voice sharp enough to draw looks from customers. Liam made change while chewing gum and humming an off-key tune, ignoring a woman trying to explain a mistake on her bill. Raymond banged a spatula louder than necessary with each plate he pushed down the line. The silence between orders was filled with judgmental glares, muttered complaints, and passive-aggressive exchanges that barely passed as communication. It was no longer a team. It was a battleground. Harold slowly stirred his coffee, catching every glance, every sigh. It was clear now the staff was divided. There were the insiders, the ones running their own schemes, insulated by arrogance and entitlement. And then there were the outliers. Tina, clearly new and unsure who to trust. The dishwasher, a shy kid who looked overwhelmed by even the simplest tasks. Raymond, a veteran likely disgusted but exhausted by the politics of confrontation. It was no longer about theft. It was about morale, about culture, about the cancer that spreads when toxicity is rewarded and goodness is ignored. Harold struck up a conversation with Tina, asking how long she'd worked there. Just a couple weeks, she said. I almost quit on day 3. He raised an eyebrow. She bit her lip, then added, They're mean. And it's not just me. Everyone seems scared of saying the wrong thing. It's like walking on glass. Her voice trembled, and Harold felt a tightness in his chest. He knew that kind of fear. It was the fear of being silenced, of becoming a casualty in a war you never signed up for. Just as he was about to ask more, Raymond called Tina to the kitchen. She nodded apologetically and hurried off. Harold watched her go, then shifted his focus to Liam, who had just stepped outside for a smoke break. Seizing the moment, Harold stood and walked to the register, where Desmond was counting bills. You the manager this morning? Harold asked, voice calm but firm. Desmond hesitated. Yeah. Why? Harold nodded slowly, then leaned in just enough for the words to land with weight. Because someone should be managing the truth around here. Desmond blinked, his mouth opening slightly. Harold walked away before he could respond. The seed was planted, not just in Desmond's mind, but in the air of the diner itself. Harold returned to his seat and waited, watching as wordlessly the tension rose. Desmond went to Kayla. They whispered. Liam returned and was immediately pulled into the huddle. Raymond watched from the line, his expression hardening. Tina returned to the counter and whispered, "What did you say to Desmond? Everyone's acting weird now." Harold smiled. Nothing untrue. The weight of suspicion had shifted. For the first time, they were no longer in control of the room. Someone had disrupted their dominance, introduced doubt into the ecosystem they'd corrupted. That's when Harold heard something that made his blood chill. From the kitchen, where Kayla thought no one could hear, she hissed, "He's not just some customer. I've seen that face before. I think he's him." Liam scoffed. "No way. He'd never show up like this. That guy's been gone for years." Kayla growled back, "I'm telling you." He looked at me like he knew everything. A pause, then a whisper Harold barely caught. "If he is him, we're screwed." The words clung to the air like smoke. Harold stayed still, sipping his now cold coffee, letting the moment steep. They were rattled. Cracks were forming. He hadn't even revealed his name yet, and already, their empire of lies was shaking. He sat for another hour, watching their fear grow in subtle shifts. The way Liam dropped his cocky smirk when customers asked questions, how Desmond double-counted every bill he handled, how Kayla avoided eye contact and left the register for long stretches without explanation. Harold didn't need to confront them yet. He had time. What he needed was one final piece of leverage, something that would not only expose their crimes but reveal how deep the rot truly went. But today he'd done enough. He'd shown them that ghosts could walk again, that silence was not the same as absence, and that the reckoning wasn't coming, it had already begun. The next day, Harold arrived before sunrise. The street lamps were still buzzing, and the town hadn't quite rubbed the sleep from its eyes. He sat in his car across the street, gripping the small USB flash drive like it was a detonator. In a way, it was. On it were weeks of compiled evidence. Surveillance footage he'd pulled through a back-channel IT contractor, financial discrepancies cross-referenced from corporate files, customer complaints that had been buried, and one particularly damning recording he'd made on his second day back. Desmond bragging to Liam about pocketing $60 from a refund scam while Kayla laughed in the background. But none of it weighed on him quite like the photo. It was grainy, a still frame captured from security footage dated 6 weeks ago. It showed Kayla in the manager's office alone, holding a framed picture, his and Marianne's, from behind the counter, one he hadn't even realized was missing. In the image, Kayla stared at the photo like it was a mirror, her face unreadable. What had she been thinking in that moment? Regret? Rage? Something more complicated? Harold stepped out of the car, his shoes crunching the fine gravel of the diner's side lot. Today was the staff's monthly meeting, scheduled before opening hours. A tradition he'd started years ago to promote transparency and camaraderie. According to the internal calendar, the district manager would be attending, but Harold had already called him late the night before, asking him to sit this one out. "I need to handle this personally," Harold had said, his voice calm but final. Now, as he approached the back door with keys that still worked after all this time, he felt a sense of closure pressing up against his ribs. This was the moment, not for vengeance but for truth, the kind that burned bridges and revealed the ones still worth crossing. Inside, the diner smelled of bleach and burnt toast. The staff was gathered in the main seating area, some sipping coffee, others looking bored. Kayla was seated near the front, arms crossed, eyes flitting toward the door every few seconds. Liam leaned back with his boots up on a chair, Desmond was half asleep, and Tina looked more nervous than usual. Raymond stood with his arms folded, watching everyone like a hawk. When Harold entered, the bell above the door chimed like a shot. Conversations halted. Chairs creaked as postures shifted. Kayla's expression hardened. Liam frowned. Desmond blinked like he wasn't sure if he was awake. Tina gasped. Raymond's eyebrows lifted, and Harold said nothing at first. He simply walked to the front, placed the flash drive on the countertop, and looked at every single face with the gravity of a man who had seen everything he needed to see. "I know who you are," Harold began, his voice low, measured, but echoing off the walls like thunder. "Not your job titles, not your names on the schedule, who you really are. And I know what you've done." The silence was so complete, he could hear someone swallow. Kayla shifted in her seat, masking her discomfort with forced confidence. "I don't know what you think you're doing," she said, her voice laced with condescension. "But you can't just barge in here like you own the place." Harold's eyes narrowed. "I do own the place." The words landed like a slap. A ripple moved through the staff. Liam muttered "Oasich," and stood up, while Desmond slowly rose, as if trying to gauge whether to deny or flee. Tina's hands covered her mouth. Raymond closed his eyes and exhaled like a weight had been lifted. Kayla, however, didn't move. She stared at Harold like she was bracing for something worse than exposure. Harold plugged the flash drive into the wall-mounted monitor and began playing footage. First, a clip of Desmond mishandling a refund, pocketing the cash. Next, Liam voiding a transaction and slipping a $20 into his apron. Then Kayla, in the office after hours, opening the safe with Liam standing guard. Finally, the still image of her holding Marianne's photo, a moment that had no criminal proof but felt like an emotional robbery all the same. He turned to face them. "You didn't just steal money. You stole trust. You vandalized a legacy. And you did it with the kind of smugness that assumes the world owes you something." Liam tried to interrupt, but Harold held up a hand. "I've already sent these clips to legal. By this time tomorrow, you'll be contacted by corporate, and law enforcement will be informed. You're done here." But Kayla didn't flinch. Instead, she stood up slowly, her voice quiet, almost trembling. Not with fear, but with fury. "You think this was just about money?" Her eyes burned. "You think I came here to scam a few bucks off a register? My mother begged your wife for help. Begged her. And she turned us away like we were nothing. Marianne was no saint. She cut people out like garbage. We lost everything. And you two sat in your perfect little booth, sipping coffee and smiling like the world outside didn't exist." Harold felt the room tilt. The betrayal had a voice now, and it wasn't greed. It was resentment. "You built this place with money that could have saved my family," Kayla hissed. "You buried us and then built your dream on top of our wreckage." Harold stood frozen. The staff was stunned into silence. Kayla's eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. "I didn't come here to steal. Not at first. I came here to see if it was true, if you two were really as perfect as everyone said. But the longer I stayed, the more I saw how fake it all was. So yeah, I took what I could. I made this place mine in the only way I knew how." Then, without another word, she turned and walked toward the door. Liam followed without protest. Desmond hesitated, then ran after them like a coward scrambling from a fire he helped light. The door slammed behind them, and the diner was still again. Harold stood motionless for a moment. The weight of Kayla's words sat heavy on his chest. Maybe there had been pain behind her actions. Maybe Marianne had made hard decisions. But none of it justified what had been done. Betrayal coated in bitterness was still betrayal. He looked around the room. Tina looked like she was about to cry. Raymond nodded once as if to say, "Now we can begin." And Harold finally exhaled, not with relief, but with the aching release of a man who'd seen the worst of what people could become, and still believed in rebuilding. The days that followed the confrontation at Harry's place moved like molasses through the heart of Fairbridge. For the townspeople, word spread like wildfire, that the mysterious man in the overcoat had been Harold Gaines all along, that he had returned not with cameras or interviews, but with justice in his pocket and sorrow in his eyes. The diner didn't close, but for 48 hours, it went dark. Harold ordered a full operational pause, not just to clean house, but to cleanse the air. Professional cleaners came through the back, but that wasn't the real rot he wanted gone. It was the energy, the silence laced with cynicism, the ghosts of stolen hours and bitter intentions. The register was replaced. The surveillance system was upgraded. But the most important changes weren't visible. They were structural, moral, cultural. Harold rehired 2 former employees who had left quietly months before, including a gentle older server named Miss Dottie who'd once taught Marian how to make rhubarb pie from scratch. She returned with misty eyes and a spine of steel, walking through the front door like she was reclaiming sacred ground. Tina was offered a full-time role and a raise, and though she was still nervous, she accepted with a stunned gratitude that reminded Harold why he had opened the place in the first place. Raymond was promoted to acting manager. Temporarily, he insisted until someone younger with clearer vision could take over. Harold said nothing in response but smiled in a way that let the man know he'd already chosen his successor. The energy in the building began to shift. The smiles became real. The laughter returned, tentative at first, then blooming like spring after a long, cruel winter. And yet, not everything could be fixed with policy or pay raises. There were things left broken, cracks too deep to simply paint over. Kayla's final words haunted Harold in ways he couldn't shake. Late at night, sitting in the back office where Marianne's portrait now hung in a new frame, he found himself replaying that bitter accusation. "You built this place with money that could have saved my family." He had always believed that he and Marianne had done their best, offered help where they could, drawn firm lines where they had to. But hearing that her decisions, his decisions, had left wounds deep enough to fester into revenge, that reality forced him to question everything. Had they turned someone away too harshly? Was Ellen's desperation genuine? Had Marianne's silence on the matter been protection or avoidance? He started digging again, not through finances but through memories. He found an old letter Marianne had never sent, tucked away in a folder labeled unsent. It was addressed to Ellen. It apologized not for refusing to help financially, but for not being stronger when the friendship first began to sour. It spoke of boundaries and lessons learned the hard way, of guilt tangled up in years of enabling someone who had burned every bridge she'd ever walked across. "I hope Kayla never inherits the anger that destroyed you," Marianne had written. Harold read it 3 times. It didn't excuse what had happened, but it explained it. Kayla hadn't just become who she was by accident. She had been raised in the echo chamber of her mother's pain, and somewhere along the way, the line between justice and vengeance blurred. That didn't make her right, but it did make her human. The following week, Harold did something no one expected. He visited the town's community center and donated a sizable check in Kayla's name, not to honor her, but to undo, in some small way, the harm that had festered between 2 families. It was a quiet act, unannounced, without media or fanfare. It didn't erase the theft. It didn't absolve the betrayal. But it opened a window, if not a door, to something more healing. Meanwhile, at the diner, the staff began holding weekly roundtables, small, informal gatherings where concerns could be voiced without fear. Tina spoke up first, then Raymond, then others joined. Harold often sat in the corner and listened, rarely speaking, but always present. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about rebuilding trust, not in management but in one another. Some customers didn't come back. The scandal had tainted their image of the place. Others returned out of curiosity, and still others never left at all. One elderly couple who'd eaten there every Friday night for 15 years left a note on a napkin that read, "You never gave up. That's why we won't either." Harold kept that note in his wallet. The booth he had once sat in alone, disguised and heartbroken, was now occupied daily by people laughing, reading newspapers, or simply sipping coffee while watching the world pass by. The picture of him and Marianne had been moved to a new frame and placed above the register, this time with a plaque beneath it that read, "For those who build with love, even when the world forgets." It was Raymond's idea, and no one argued. Still, some questions remained. Harold never heard from Kayla again. She vanished like smoke, no calls, no letters, no headlines. Part of him wondered if she would resurface someday, if she'd read about the community center donation and feel something, anger, regret, relief. But the silence was its own kind of answer. Desmond and Liam were dealt with through formal legal channels, and while Harold never pursued maximum punishment, he made sure their records reflected the truth. But even that felt like dust compared to the real cleanup that had taken place. The moral one, the personal one. the one that couldn't be documented in spreadsheets or policy memos. Harold stood outside the diner one evening as the sun dipped behind the buildings, the last rays turning the windows gold. He watched the silhouettes move inside. Tina wiping a table, Raymond laughing with a customer, a new hire taking an order with eager nods. He felt tired, but not the kind of tired that came from defeat. It was the exhaustion of closure, of knowing a battle had been fought and something sacred had been reclaimed. Not perfectly, not entirely, but enough. He took one last breath of the evening air and walked away, not because he was giving up, but because he finally trusted the place to stand without him. And in the quiet echo of that moment, Harold Gaines didn't feel like a man who had returned from exile. He felt like a man who had finished mourning. And that was enough.